Topic 7.1 is on energy choices and security. We will focus in this topic about why various countries choose different types of energy and how sustainable and secure they are in using those economically, terrorism, environmentally, and so forth. Well, we'll start with the obvious one here, which is fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are fairly non-renewable. They take a long time to be created, and we use them up very fast. Basically, we're talking about oil, coal, natural gas. I suppose shale could have been included in that also. There are advantages and disadvantages to it, and it's a certain amount of inertia. It's hard to move away from fossil fuels. The advantages, certainly for the United States, they're cheap, they're plentiful. We have quite a bit here. We don't have enough to really export it, but we certainly have enough for our domestic needs. And the big problem, of course, with fossil fuels, or when I say problem, I mean inertia, unwillingness to move away from it, is that there's no substitution for the enormous amount of energy you get from it. So if you think about 1 gallon of gasoline in your car, how much incredible energy and mileage you get from that. So it's already in place in the United States. We've been doing it for a long time, and the technology is there, the extraction techniques. The disadvantages, as we're finding out now with climate change and so forth, and we studied this when we looked at greenhouse gases, is the enormous amount of carbon which is putting into the air, creating all sorts of problems. But in another sense, it's unsustainable. Eventually, we will run out of fossil fuels. Now, I've been around for a long time, and they've been saying this for a long time. We still discover new sources of fossil fuels, offshore drilling, for example. But eventually, we will run out of it. So let's talk about why that's happening. First of all, consumption. 80% of the world's energy use is based on fossil fuels. That's a lot. The world is hooked on fossil fuels. And what has been happening is as countries, particularly China, start to get developed, the demand for it is increasing. They're no longer an LEDC. They want the same things that we do. So even though previously it was higher use in MEDCs, more countries are now getting developed, moving to becoming MEDCs, and so we're having greater consumption of fossil fuels. And there is a certain amount of competition that's going on, certainly between China and the United States, and this drives the price up. Let's talk about shale. You may have heard a lot about this. There are large shale fields up in Canada, and they wanted to build the Keystone Pipeline to bring a lot of that extracted material down here. You also get a lot of natural gas that comes from shale deposits here. There's a technique called fracking, which is used to extract that from the sedimentary rock. You inject high pressure water to kind of break it up. It's a good method, except it creates a large amount of pollution, so the water runoff is a problem. It leaches and destroys habitats. And also you release a lot of methane. Now they have been talking, a technocentric solution, about coming up with better methods for fracking, but that's still on the horizon. Renewable and alternative energy sources. So we said that fossil fuels are not really renewable. But what would be renewable? Well, to begin with, we'd like to move to more renewable, certainly long-term advantages. It's sustainable and creates a lot less pollution. But there's been a slow movement towards using quote-quote green fuels. Often they're very expensive. We require new technology, and again, we have a certain amount of resistance. So think about all the gasoline stations in the United States. What would happen if we didn't use gasoline anymore? So let's talk about, in the second part of this slideshow here, what are renewable energy sources. First of all, let's start with hydroelectric power. Here in the Northwest, we rely a lot on this. We have a lot of water, and we were smart enough to build a lot of dams. It was expensive to construct those dams at one point. However, it became cheap when the government got involved. A lot of them were built by Depression-era TVA projects, for example, the Bonneville Dam. Unfortunately, though, dams brought with them a lot of problems. Areas had to be flooded, people were displaced, habitats were destroyed, you had increased erosion. I suppose you could also say it's difficult for animals like salmon to do migration. But you get an enormous amount of free energy. Simply the movement of water as it goes downstream turns turbines, which creates electricity, which then can be put into long-distance power lines and brought to other places. The same thing could be done actually out in the ocean. You don't need to have rivers. There's a tidal movement of water in and out. You could simply have floating turbines out there. This is a new technology. Kind of expensive to get in place there, but a lot of free energy once you get it, and certainly renewable. I suppose this could also interfere with fish and navigation, so that could be a problem. Then there's always solar energy. Large amounts of panels are required to generate enough cheap energy for homes. It is very expensive to install, and some of the elements inside the solar panels are not really renewable. You can get credits to put them on your house, and the electricity that you generate gets hooked up to the electrical grid, so you could get a rebate there. But the limiting factor, of course, is that it doesn't work unless we've got a lot of sunshine, and that doesn't take place in all parts of the world. Similarly, there's wind power. Again, it wouldn't really be effective unless you were in a windy area here. Pretty expensive to get one of these guys going in place. Again, the energy gets put into the general electrical grid, and you probably get a rebate. It's not like everyone has one on their home. And certainly this wouldn't be a very effective solution to have in a dense urban area. Now let's talk about biofuels. So we can take traditional fossil fuels, gasoline, and we can mix it with biofuels, alcohol. Typically it comes from corn, but that has a problem also. So you need a lot of energy to raise the corn and then use it. Now there are some places where you've seen these cars that have these strange hookups, and what they're using basically is organic waste material to produce fuel. Good idea. It is decomposable, biodegradable, so that also has an advantage, and it produces less carbon emissions. Geothermal. Some countries are lucky enough. Iceland, for example, I think relies almost totally on geothermal activity. Pretty much this is a renewable. Eventually it'll wear out as the earth cools down, but I don't think that's a problem for the foreseeable future. Water can also be pumped into the ground and recirculated to change the temperature. So we can rely on the temperature of the ground and the difference between the temperature of the atmosphere. Nuclear power. Now, when I was growing up, nuclear power had a very bad reputation because it had meltdown issues. 3 Mile Island was a noted meltdown in the Pennsylvania River area. But lately, nuclear power is becoming popular again. And the reason is it is carbon-free. It does not contribute to global warming. It's very complicated how you run a nuclear power plant, but the idea, or the end game, is pretty simple. Essentially, you want to use a nuclear reaction to heat up water, create steam, which again, all it does is physically turn a turbine, just like we saw before in the tidal ones or the hydroelectric ones, and that creates electricity. And that's why you have nuclear power plants typically near water sources, the ocean or the river. They need the water, and they certainly need the water to cool down the process, cooling towers, so that you don't have a meltdown situation. There are advantages and disadvantages to it. The technology is available. We have approximately, I believe, 100 nuclear power plants already in the United States. They are carbon-free, very efficient. The disadvantages, radioactive waste. Now, techniques have gotten better to control that. But you still have the possibility of meltdowns. We've had some significant meltdowns. Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, Fukushima in Japan, and so forth. But I think that the major limiting factor is the expense. It is somewhere in the order of $15 billion. I could be wrong about that number, to build a nuclear power plant. Large investment, and you don't get that investment back for a long, long time. It's very difficult to see how private companies are going to do that any longer. I think the only way we'll have nuclear power really take off in this country again is if the government decides to invest the money. We've seen that already in Europe, pretty much France, Germany, these sort of countries. If you also look at Japan, they rely a lot on nuclear power, but it was from government projects here. I think there's also a problem here. NIMBY, which is an acronym that stands for Not in My Backyard. Even people who are in favor of nuclear power, yeah, but don't put it in my neighborhood. Once you go ahead and decide what sort of energy system you want to use, and I think it's reasonable that countries should not rely on just one type of energy, you have to secure that energy. And as demand goes up, it's harder and harder to do it. So let's look at oil. As competition between China and other countries goes up, it's harder and harder to have a secure supply of oil. You also have increased terrorism. That's always a problem. We're going to look in just a moment at countries that around the world that have large amounts of oil. They tend not to be democratic countries. That's a problem as far as terrorism goes. And then we also have global warming, which is a big, big problem with non-renewable energy sources. So let's just take a look at the one I had mentioned there. Here's a map that shows what countries, and the size of the country is dependent on how much oil they have. You can see Saudi Arabia is number one. If I were asking on a test here, can you go ahead and describe the trends there? We would say a large number of them are in the Middle East. We would also say that a large number of them are not highly industrialized countries, but we also might say that most of the countries that control the oil in the world are not democratic countries. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, Iran, Venezuela has been having trouble lately, Libya and so forth. And that means that the world is having a difficult time securing the supply of energy. There's probably a reason why the United States invests so much money into its 7th Fleet. This is part of the Navy, which is out in the Middle East and kind of patrols the Persian Gulf and those areas to make sure the supply of oil continues here. So what will be the factors that a country would use to decide? And I think, again, it's hard to have a country have one source. Not good to put all your eggs in one basket. Well, every country will have to make a different decision. What might be the factors? Availability and sustainability. If I was a country that had lots of oil, well, that's the way I'd go. If I was Iceland, that had a lot of geothermal activity, then that's the way I'd go for that. You'd look to see if you have the technology available. You don't want to put a lot of money and time into developing technology which isn't readily available. What are the politics of the country? Don't kid yourself. The fact that we're an oil-based economy has a lot to do with our politics, particularly when you go down to states like Texas, Louisiana, Oklahoma, which really depend on oil. The economics, what can we afford? Do we have to compete? So in the United States, for example, as we're competing with China more and more for oil reserves, we'd probably want to move to something which is more domestically produced. And then finally, there's cultural and environmental. The car is a big, big part of the culture of the United States. It's going to be hard for us to get away from it. Some places are starting to do it. For example, California, I believe, just passed a law that in 2035, you can no longer buy a combustion engine. So we'll see how that goes. Finally, energy conservation. How can we go ahead and get ourselves more time? Well, the energy grid right now in the United States is very interesting. We have a grid which produces enough power so that at any point of the day, if every single person wanted to turn on their light bulb, there would be enough energy for it. And that is why when you drive at night and you pass downtown city areas, you see so many of the buildings lit up, even though there's probably nobody in them. A lot of countries don't do that. For example, you might have a 75% grid. Now, that has a problem. If you did have an emergency and everybody needed all the energy, you would have what they call a brownout. But many countries decide it's worth the risk. For example, I remember when I was living in Spain that many of the apartment buildings there had timers on their lights. So instead of just turning a light on and staying on, you would click a switch, the timer would give you maybe a minute, you'd walk down the hallway to get where you needed to go, and then the lights would go off. They had an idea of conservation. Now we could try and thread the needle and just say, well, we'll just improve our efficiency. Great idea. Hard to do that, though. And finally, we want to reduce the losses that we have with energy. And that concludes Our topic